Now we are entering our next session, the North American Urban Indigenous Food Systems, sponsored by the Food and Agricultural Initiative, an organization, and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. It's moderated by Hannah Neufeld, and Associate Professor, School of Public Health Sciences from the University of Waterloo, Ontario. And we welcome every one of the panelists here. It's so beautiful. So take it away.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to do not very much speaking this morning because I really want to spend the time listening from our amazing panel here that we've gathered today. So first of all, though, I do want to express my gratitude to the conference organizers. Is that better? For all of the support that they've given us in terms of getting ready for this event. This is my third time attending the conference, and I'm always just amazed at what I take away from this conference and go back and share with the communities that I work with. We also, as a panel, want to express our gratitude not just to the planning committee, but also to the Shakopee Sioux community for inviting us onto their territory these past several days and again tomorrow. I also want to acknowledge the work that's gone into building this network that we're going to share a little bit about today. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, Michaela Way, who works for them. She's in Rome today, preparing for Indigenous Youth Summit, so she's not able to be with us today. But she's been really instrumental in bringing us all together. And we also have some support, as was mentioned, from the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. So as a larger network that's focused on urban Indigenous food systems and working within cities across Turtle Island, we began meeting via Zoom. This is some of our very first time actually meeting in person at this event, so it's very exciting. So we began meeting on Zoom in June 2022. And with the idea, Michaela and I had to really strengthen some of these bonds and networks that have begun mobilizing across Turtle Island. So within Canada, where Dave and I work, and also across the US as well. So we have representatives today, so members of the panel, Dave Skene, who I work with very closely within Southern Ontario in Kitchener-Waterloo area. He's the Executive Director of White Isle Native Ancestry Association and a member of the Wasco Collective that he'll talk a little bit more about. And then we have Christine and Clifford Bruno, who come to us from Portland, Oregon, who've been doing amazing work in and around that city for, I think, over 25 years now. And then Sara, Moncada, who's the CEO of the Culture Conservancy, who works in and around the Bay Area in California. So that's all. I'm going to leave it for that, and I'll let Dave take it away, and we look forward to your questions at the end of the panel. Thank you.
Good morning. It's great to be here. We as a panel decided that we didn't want to be separated from all of you by having a podium between us and you. And that could be maybe because we're more storytellers. I know I am. And so I really want to tell a few stories related to developing like a land base for our urban Indigenous youth and not just our youth, but for the urban Indigenous community in the Waterloo region, where I am from. The Waterloo region is about an hour west of Toronto, just so you have a geographical idea. And within that region, there is approximately 15 to 20,000 Indigenous people from all over Canada. Actually, we're quite a ways from the East Coast, but the largest number of Indigenous people within the region are Mi'kmaq from Nova Scotia and that area. So it's maybe a little bit different than other cities, as most of the Indigenous community is from away, as they say, from a long way away. So I'm Métis. I don't know if everybody knows who the Métis are. I'll just do like a really brief. Métis people came about in the genesis of them was in the late 1700s as mostly, but not just, French men who had left towns, cities, and villages in eastern Canada to go out west and actually become a part of the Indigenous communities in Western Canada, mostly related to fur trade and survival. And out of that out of the marriage of Indigenous women within communities and these French men, their children, who saw themselves as not fully First Nations and not fully French, began to develop their own communities all through Western Canada. Those communities became a blend of First Nations culture and European culture, and also their language, Michif, which Wasco to Winawak is a word that we'll hear. That's a Michif, Cree Michif word, and that word comes out of the blending of those two cultures and languages. So I come from that. My family was from Lesser Slave Lake, Alberta, which is a Métis community, and also from the Red River area, which is Winnipeg. They eventually settled into a Métis, small Métis community on the Great Lakes. And then I grew up in southwestern Ontario because a lot of the Métis people moved to Hamilton, which is a city, industrial city in southern Ontario, and they moved there during the wars, the First and Second World War, to make ammunition for the wars. Anyway, I am a part of the Wasco to Winawak collective, which was formed. I had been living out west and working in a First Nations community on the west coast, and I'd come back to Kitchener to look after family. And when I returned, I went to one of the well-known elders of that community in the Waterloo region, and I said, what could I do? And she said, go out and connect with the youth in the community. And I'd been a youth worker for a long time, so that wasn't a big deal. So I just did that, started hanging out with a number of Indigenous youth in the community. And as I did, and as we spoke, we began to talk about like our disconnection, not only theirs, but also mine, our disconnection to the land, as we were people who now saw ourselves as urban. Many of the youth I was connecting with were second, third generation urban Indigenous people who no longer really had a significant connection to their reservation or traditional territory. I hadn't been to my traditional territory since I was a kid, when I used to go up to work up there. And so we began to talk about like this loss of land. And so my first response was like, maybe we need to make trips up to the lands, to the north and where we're from. But then I began to think, no, like maybe the lands are here. Like this is now our home. And as Indigenous people, as a Métis person, we adapt to the environments we come into. And so I began to think maybe we need to learn how to adapt. But how do we adapt in an urban environment where everything seemed to be owned by somebody, and access just wasn't there for us in the same way it would be in traditional spaces? So out of that, talking to the youth, a group of us, Indigenous scholars, researchers, settler researchers who wanted to connect with us, we began to ask the question, how do we as Indigenous people who are now mostly urbanized, how do we belong to the land in which we live? And can we belong to the land and the city? And I think as we waited and listened and talked through things, we began to think, yeah, we can belong to this land. And so the simplest thing we could do is we started a little garden. And when I've heard all these stories of other people's gardens, I'm quite amazed. Our first garden was 10 by 10. And I had never grown anything in my life. I had never planted anything. And I had some elders pass some seeds on to me. I put them in this little 10 by 10. All I knew about the science of growing food was you needed a seed, you needed some rain, you needed some dirt, and you needed sunshine. And so that was the science. So I put the seeds in, and they grew. We were all amazed. And so that was our first little assignment, to kind of reconnect us into the cities where we lived. Wasak to Winawak kind of grew out of that first little garden and out of our communications together and creating community around that little garden. And Wasak to Winawak made sense. Like, we were trying to figure out, who are we, what's our name? And Wasak to Winawak made sense because as a Michif word, it means after a fire has gone through the lands, the first green shoots that come up, that's Wasak to Winawak. So it meant newness, new people, new ways of doing things, all that kind of stuff. So the whole aspect of newness. So we started calling ourselves Wasak to Winawak, and we started looking for more places for us to belong. So one of the things we started talking about too was the whole idea of that there was some negative concepts, both colonial concepts and even within the Indigenous community, that as Indigenous people who now found our homes in the city, that wasn't quite right. Like, we shouldn't find our homes in the city. It was okay to go to work or go to school or that kind of thing, but you needed to return home. And also from the colonial aspect, there was no place for the city because they saw Indigenous people as out there in the forests, in their romantic ideas of who Indigenous people were. And so we really saw that we needed to kind of break those ideas. I had, one of the things that kind of really changed me around this is I had a dream around this time. And in this dream, I saw this old room, a kitchen. And in the kitchen, I just saw these hands, and these hands were making coffee. But it was like in the 1940s, so it was an old coffee percolator and different things like that. And as the coffee was being made, eventually an older couple, I could still only see their arms, sat down, and they poured the coffee and they started drinking it together. And as they did that, they started speaking a language that I didn't understand. And so when I woke up, I was just like, I think that was Michif. That was the language of my grandparents and my great-grandparents. And I went to my mom and I told her about the dream. And my mom was like, oh yeah, like when I was a little girl, I used to wake up, I lived with my grandparents. And when I was a little girl, I would wake up and I would listen to them speaking Michif through the walls. And as I listened to that, I just felt so comforted, so her grandparents were drinking coffee, and she was hearing their Michif and feeling comforted by what was going on with the language. And I thought that was so significant, and it made me think, like, how do we bring the bones of our ancestors? Which was a word or a term I had heard quite a bit. How do we bring the bones of our ancestors as urban Indigenous people from the place of territory and tradition and ceremony? How do we bring them into the city? And so that's been kind of the driving, that dream has been a driving force for me. Over the years, Wasauqton-Winnewauk has a number of different growing places. I'm just going to skip through this. You can read it because I don't want to take up too much time. But we've started now negotiating for land within the city with the federal government, with our federal government, regional government, municipal government, and with the treaty governments around us. So we're trying to really establish a land base within the city. But I wanted to move on from all that politics. Everybody knows all about politics, so I don't want to spend a lot of time with that. And talk about the best thing in the whole world, which is the best place ever, the maple sugar bush. And I want to tell you the story about how we got a maple sugar bush. I think it was about 2017, a friend of mine who was the executive director of the organization I now work for, White Owl Native Ancestry Association. She got a phone call from a United Church. And the United Church said, we would love to, if you could come and spend 3 minutes with us, we would like to give you a donation of $2,000. And so Michelle, who hated the church, said no, and then kind of hung up. Well, when she said no, there was an elder sitting right beside her, and she was like, you know, I don't think you should say no to those things because you never know who's going to be an ally. And so you should call him back. So obviously, because the elder said you should call him back, Michelle called him back and said, yeah, okay, I'll come and pick up the check. And so she went. It was a Sunday school class. She went to the Sunday school. She spoke for 3 minutes. At the end, an elder, one of the elders of the church met her, was walking her out the door, gave her the check for $2,000 or whatever it was. And then he said, like, if there's anything we can ever do for you, just let us know. And right away, out of her mouth, she said, give us some land. And then the elder was like, are you serious? And she was like, yeah. And he was like, okay, just sit down here for a second. And he ran off and he got another one of the leaders of the church, and they came back. And they're like, we have been sitting on a piece of land since 1964. We bought it. And then we weren't sure what to do with it because it got protected. So there's this little salamander, well, actually it's a big salamander, called the Jefferson salamander. And the Jefferson salamander lives there, and it's disappearing at a rapid pace. So they protected that land for the salamander, so the church couldn't do anything with the land. And so they said, would you like it? And so Michelle said, yes. So they went through a bit of a process, and then we had a ceremony out on the land with some of the Indigenous leaders and church leaders. And we bought that land in Canadian money. We were supposed to buy it for a loonie, which is $1, but nobody had a loonie, so we gave them a toonie, which is $2. So just like colonization, we still had to pay twice as much for the Anyway, so, and then they gave us a rock. They had picked out a rock from the land, and we exchanged the toonie and the rock. And when we made that exchange, all the birds in the forest started singing. It was like amazing. Like, you couldn't have planned it. Well, with wild birds, you couldn't plan it, but it just happened. And so they just started singing, it seemed like hundreds of them. And so we knew this was a good thing. So we made the exchange, and then after that, we sat on the land. We went and visited the land over the period of a year, just asking the land, what should we do here? How should we be in relationship with you? And so eventually we thought, well, let's make maple syrup. You know, we felt like the trees were communicating to us about making maple syrup. none of us urban folks knew how to make maple syrup, and so I volunteered to be the first maple syrup maker. And so I bought a little pail. We tapped 5 trees, and I boiled in a pot, a big pot. I think it was about this big, and I thought this was great. I was making probably half a liter a day, and oh, am I taking too long? I think so.
No, you're fine. You're fine, good.
Anyway, I'll keep going really quickly. So we made maple syrup, and it worked, and it was delicious. So then we bought a big evaporator. That's the big evaporator there. Now we do about 160, 170 liters of syrup a year, which is shared without the community. But the important part of maple syrup is not just the act of making maple syrup. Maple syrup, the gift from the maple tree that's given to us, has become such a big part of the economy. And it's always pretty much seen as dollars and cents. But in the Métis tradition, and I know for many Anishinaabe peoples who live in the area where there's maple trees, and probably here as well, because I know there's maple trees here, maple season is the time we renew our relationship with the land. And so that's the significance of having the maple tree, or the maple syrup. So we renew ourselves. There's nothing more beautiful than going out in the winter, in the snow, setting up camp, and staying there through the whole season until the spring and it's warm. And there's that beautiful gold. I have more, but I'm talking too much. So. I'm really happy to share with you.
Katamika, Clifton, Bruno, Wasco. Beings raised on the reservation and majority of indigenous foods, when he had moved into the urban setting, we had seen a lot of my relatives not connecting with each other or the earth. And we thought, what can we do? So we thought, bring foods back, because one of the reasons I'm so healthy is because at a young age, I had indigenous foods, was my majority staple. And like one of our favorite treats here, the fiddleheads, in our travels, you see the big fiddleheads are from Hawaii. And one of our outreaches with one of our programs, we ended up on the East Coast and had found, which had kind of excited us, fiddleheads being sold in the store. So
hi, I'm Christine Bruno. I'm his other half. I'm Basque Comanche Irish, but I married this fish Indian, so I'm a Comanche that cooks salmon.
there's something fishy about it.
So, but yeah, our kind of point of the previous slide was we all have things in common. You know, we're all from different places here, and I've met people from Hawaii, a person who's also Basque, hi Stormy, and like me, and so that's very exciting to see our connections. And what we're going to talk about today is Indigenous access to public lands. And when you're in the urban setting, that's what you have to do. And so we've worked with a lot of different organizations. There's kind of was a grassroots organizing effort of people with like-mindedness to come together, and that's still growing and changing along the way, and partnering with different nonprofit organizations in our area with government entities that have the titles to pieces of natural areas. In the Portland metro area, not only do we have representatives from the 9 tribal groups in Oregon, but we also, there's about 380 different tribes within the Portland area A lot of that's because of assimilation practices in the United States of giving people one-way bus tickets with promises of great jobs and opportunities. And Portland was one of the areas that people were sent to, along with other places on the West Coast.
And here is one of the metro sites. It's called Comanche Prairie. And the top photo is of the area in March, and then mid-March. And the next photo was at the beginning of April. And Comanche is one of our bulb foods, which is camas, highly nutritious. When we cook it for 3 days, full days, with a fire over it in a pit. And you do not want to eat it raw because the starches are so complex that if we try to eat it raw, you would have a tummy ache because we could not digest it.
Quamish is over a 100-acre area that we work with there. There was only about 2 acres that was left undisturbed since time immemorial. We call it the ancestral patch. And from that, we then are now spreading it across the rest of the 100 acres that was a potato farm for about 100 years.
And the farmers that were there mentioned to us, one of the old elders, he remembered when they were kids that Warm Springs, my tribe, had ridden in to gather the camas, and they were kind enough to leave that ancestral camas there for us to keep harvesting from.
So when we gather, all tools are welcome, both traditional style and contemporary tools. And prior to gathering, we of course have ceremony and bless the land and thank the camas for being there for us. And in this photo that I snapped one year, the man in the black, starting with him in the black jacket and tan pants, he's Coquille. The next one's Cow Creek, and Silet's holding our sacred bundle. Then Nimipu or Nez Perce, and the one in all blue rain suit is our youngest son, Devin. So he's Wasco and Comanche. And we're all there together working with the land cooperatively. As we harvest, we do harvest a little bit to have a little sample, but one of our main goals, you'll see how there's patches, and then we take and harvest from the patches and then replant into other areas that do not have camas growing to keep spreading it out over what was a potato farm. And we have all ages, and we have the children and elders working together, which is real important at this site and important in all the things that we do. And something, one of the people who worked with us on the site from Metro Parks and Green Spaces, she's from Minnesota, and she's now just moved back about a year ago. We had a visit with her, and she says, you've got to tell them when the day that Prince passed away, we were out there. This is a picture from that day, actually, amongst all the purple camas. And she felt it was very appropriate to be amongst purple, surrounded by purple on that day. So little local connection there. There are definitely 2 species of camas there, the common camas and the great camas. But Clifton and I have been out there doing a lot of the hands-on restoration work in the ancestral patch, where we do not allow any herbicides or pesticides to be used at all. And we are seeing a third kind of camas, and we don't know what that one's scientific name is, or if it has a scientific name. We don't know if it's a known species or what yet. We're still talking to people about this. As you know, we're seeing a third kind that blooms later and is really tall. It's actually, I'm 5 foot tall, and it was up at my head. Really tall camas. There's not a lot of them, but they're there.
And through all this work with them, we've been showing them that my ancestors didn't just gather from our lands, we actually managed our lands.
And part of that management is watching out. There's a plant that looks almost identical, that's common name is death camas. In the picture there, that white one is not a death camas, it's just a white variation. There's a few of them that pop up each year because death camas has a different shape of flower than the common camas or great camas. And so it's important to be out there when it's blooming and to watch for any death camas, because we want everyone to be safe, because it's called death camas for a reason. And then you can see the bulbs there. When you peel off all the outer skins and stuff, people say they look like little onions.
And then when you cook them in the pit, here we have many ages helping and learning. We learn from each other. The elders and the children learn from it. And you always want to do a pit cook in as clean as possible soil, because what you cook in goes into the food. And here we're opening up the pit, and you see the delicious, sweet golden globes there. They are so sweet. Making my mouth water right now.
The pit, we have I won't go into all the details, we don't have time, but it takes at least 2 days, sometimes 3 to do that. This is our granddaughter, and in the picture, the first picture, she's helping, she just came over and helped me process camas, and she just jumped right in and was doing it. And then the second picture was just this last year, 2 years after the first picture, and she was out there with us, and she wanted to do it herself. The work we were doing, because we're doing restoration work while we're out there, is we're going to where there's patches of invasive reed canary grass, because we don't want to use any chemicals, and we're hand digging it out, which is not easy. But while we're doing that, we remove the camas from that area. And so for her to dig a camas on her own, she had to identify the reed canary grass. So she learned to identify at 6 years old, amongst all those many grasses out in the prairie, the reed canary grass, and then dig a camas out of the reed canary grass. And she was very proud of that accomplishment. And I think it's pretty cool for a 6-year-old.
And here is what we call the Native Gathering Garden at Cully Park in town. This was when it was first opened, and this was the gathering circle.
It's an industrial landfill that's then been covered up and capped and made into a park. And we have 8 acres of this park for the Native Gathering Garden. It started being planned in about 10 years ago, and that's when we got involved with the planning phase, engaging with our local Indigenous community. And then this picture here was taken in 2017. That year, we also did a lot of planting with community.
And it was accessible to everybody. You notice the person in the wheelchair. We try to include everybody.
This site, unlike the previous one, because it's within the city, people can access it via our public transportation systems, or ride a bicycle, or if they're in the neighborhood, walk over there. And the paved paths and gravel paths allow access for elders easily. 2 years later, this is some of what it looked like. And that's actually the same granddaughter, but only 2 years old in this picture.
Standing next to the fireweed.
Mm-hmm. So those are all in that picture. It's 90% native plants. There is a little chicory in one of them, which is not a native plant, but we let it stay for the pollinators. And the site is being used for teaching job skills, in working in the environment, for community gatherings and cultural things like storytelling, our son's storytelling there. And in the foreground of that photo is wild oats that grow on site. And right over his head, I don't know how well you can see it, is an airplane, a big jet. And the airport's really close by. We have airplane noise and train noise on a regular basis. And it just kind of reminds you of where you're at. Thank you so much for all your time and listening to our story.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to see you all. This is my first time at this conference, and I'm so inspired. This is, sometimes we get stuck in our communities, not stuck in a bad way, but we feel, like not everybody else out there in the world knows and understands. And sometimes it's wonderful to come together in circles like this and share and get to know all of the other incredible work that's going on out there, and learning from one another and figuring out how we can all do it better moving forward in a really good way. So I'm so inspired by everybody. Thank you. It's very cool. There's very good work happening. My name is Sara. I'm from the Cultural Conservancy. We're based in San Francisco. And just to get started in a good way, these are the lands and the waters that I come from. On my father's side, I carry Yaqui ancestry, which is from the Sonoran Desert region of this American continent before somebody picked up a piece of paper and a pencil and drew a line and called that a map and called part of that the United States, the other part of that Mexico. That's home. So there is the Xiac-Vatwe, our Yaqui River, the birthplace of our people from our Tait mountain regions that flows all the way out to the Gulf Coast of Mexico. We are mountain people, river people, desert people, and ocean people. I cannot leave behind my beautiful mother. On my mother's side, I carry Irish, predominantly Irish ancestry, a little Scandinavian ancestry in there somewhere. And she comes in her ancestral DNA from a beautiful island on the other side of this planet. And as an Indigenous woman, that matters to me because it means that my relationship and responsibility to land is not just here, it's somewhere else too. And that deep relationship and responsibility carries songs and dances and knowledge systems that are all about first relationships to the ground beneath our feet. So I try and show up here as a complete human being with all of those songs dancing through me. The Cultural Conservancy has been in business for almost 40 years. We're almost 40 years old. And our mission is to work in service to ancestral people and ancestral lands. And this is just a bit of the storyscape that we have in all that we do, both in tending land and tending our human ecologies. We have a regional reach. We work regionally within the San Francisco Bay Area Network region of Northern California. But yeah, we also reach nationally and work on some beautiful national systems. Hi, Denisa. We have a lot of folks and partners in here that we work with, and also an international reach. We're very honored to have a small regranting fund where we try to honor our reciprocity as Indigenous people and give back in small ways and help folks in grassroots organizations or ways that can't get to a larger conversation such as these, try and figure out how to take those steps to expand those systems of sharing. I'm here to talk specifically about kind of our urban and regional Indigenous work. I want to talk a little bit about that ecosystem and let you know what that means. A lot of us here have been talking about, especially, the Brunos were just talking about the role that Portland played in that kind of relocation space. The San Francisco and Oakland Bay Area region also played a very important role in the relocation system, but that's kind of that second layer of the hoop dance, if you will. That first circle of service is really to where we are with our lands in service to our California Native relatives. So our first home base is that kind of bottom dot, that little bottom red dot, is the San Francisco Peninsula, what we lovingly call Yalamu, which is our beautiful Ramaytush Ohlone relatives space. We expand out as we go north. That middle red dot that you'll see there was our first kind of large-scale land project space, is a partnership with Indian Valley Organic Farm and Gardens, which is a part of the College of Marin, which is a small university there that opened up a community farm and invited us in to be an Indigenous partner there. And then in 2019, I still get goosebumps when I say it, the Cultural Conservancy had the very deep honor and privilege and responsibility to walk through a land back project. And in 2019, we became stewards of 7.6 acres of land in one of the largest, most expensive land places in the United States, in the Napa Valley wine country, Sonoma region. But what that means to all of our circles of service is that really what we're talking about is land access, right? So much of us are here to talk about what that means and the impacts that that can have, especially in our nutrition and our spaces. Anywhere in the San Francisco Bay Area where you're California native or you are an intertribal member of the community as a good guest, such as myself, then we recognize that really it's about what it means to have access to clean water, clean land, and healthy food. Our approach to any type of land tending is in restoration first. This is an example of traditional ecological restoration in San Francisco. We're very honored in that first land space that we tended in San Francisco through our historical work and our first CEO, Miss Melissa Nelson, who many of you may know. This was one of her first major projects, was the restoration of El Polin Springs in San Francisco as the last remaining freshwater spring on the San Francisco Peninsula. It's located inside of the Presidio, which is a military base, which was the home base where they brought the California Native people and then marched them out to the Mission Dolores system as part of the building of that cityscape. But then it takes you to Indian Valley. And I want to talk about this one. I'll spend a tiny bit of extra time on this picturescape here. Indian Valley Organic Farm Garden is about 30 minutes across the Golden Gate Bridge, okay? So if you're in the middle of the urban landscape of San Francisco or Oakland, you're going to drive 30 minutes to get to here, which is here, again, just a small partnership space. We only tend about 4 or 5 growing rows here on that kind of a scale, so to speak. And really, this place has become very important to us. It's urban accessible. We can bring our Native community from the San Francisco city centers or the Oakland city centers to this space without too much trouble and have good conversations here. What we understand is that most of our Indigenous communities, this is reality for all of us, is many of them live in what we call food deserts. I cannot say that without recognizing that I'm a desert woman. As a Yaqui woman, I experience deserts as lush, nutritious, exceptionally abundant ecologies, okay? So a lot of love to the desert region, but I understand the value of words and what we know and what we need to do in order to come together to create change. So food deserts as places where there is not access to food for many, many reasons, whether they be health, ecological, land access, et cetera, economic. We have lots of issues here. And for most in the San Francisco Bay Area inner city community of urban network, many of those kids, like you see on the lower part of these photographs, these are kids that came out from the Mission District. The one meal that they get a day is school lunch. And occasionally when their parents can afford to buy dinner, they buy it at McDonald's. And this is the reality of a lot of the kids that we're working with. So when we can bring them out to a landscape like this and walk them into the middle of the field and say, this is your ancestral food, and they pick up a squash and go, what's that? And I looked at this kid and I said, that's a squash. You have a relationship to it, I promise. I double dog dare you to eat it. And he's like, yeah. Whoa, that's good. I was like, great, go tell your friends. And this is everybody coming together to have that kind of day together. And at the end of this day, when we bust these kids out, we sent them home with boxes of food to their families from what they harvested in the field that day. That was our growing space. That was our learning space. I'm not sure that we knew that many years later we would have access to what we are now calling Heron Shadow. Heron Shadow, as I mentioned, is just over 7 acres. This is just outside of, if you know the San Francisco Bay Area region, this is just outside of Sebastopol. We have a Sebastopol address. We're not sure why, because technically I think we're in Forestville. But we run along the Green Valley watershed system that runs out into the Russian River watershed system that runs out into the ocean out by Bodega Bay. And we are surrounded by commercial grape vineyards. And we, just like Dave was talking about, when we walked into the land, we spent a year sitting there listening and calling our community together and saying, what do you hear? What do you see? What stories do you want to help us rise here? How can we have this space be in service to all that we know we need to do together? And through that, we are calling it a biocultural indigenous heritage oasis. Say that 5 times fast. But all of those words matter because we are trying to bring our relatives to a safe, clean, accessible land space to practice land-based traditions in whatever form that matters to the relatives standing there. Whether that's language reclamation, seed sovereignty, food sovereignty, or honestly, some inner city kids coming out from Oakland with their families to camp in the trees and get away from the hustle and bustle and understand what it means to look out into the sky and see stars. This is an important space, and we're taking it very seriously. We brought fire back to this land. We are doing a riparian restoration in order to make sure that the waters that are here are clean so that whatever foods we cultivate moving forward can all be done in a good and healthy way. Clean water, clean land means healthy people. We are running agricultural food systems and seed sovereignty systems. We have a seed bank. We don't publish or acknowledge how many varieties of seeds that we have because we are working to acknowledge the sovereignty of every community that we partner with. Some want us to share, some don't. Some want us to do a grow out and simply send it back. Others want us to distribute the foods out into community and get them out to all of the relatives that have been dislocated or relocated. And whatever that storyscape may be, we are here to try and support the sovereignty of each individual group so that their story can be told the way they choose. These are our beautiful fields. We are ending our third growing season this year. And we are very honored that through our Food Justice Network, we are partnered with incredible Bay Area network partners, Tait Land Trust, California Indian Museum and Cultural Center, the Indian Health Centers of both San Francisco, Bay Area, and Oakland and Sonoma County, American Indian Child Resource Center, American Indian Cultural District of San Francisco, the very first urban cultural district to rise in the United States. This is an incredible space to be, and we are working with them to distribute food out to the region. Our goal is to not sell food. Our goal is to feed people who are hungry, not just because they can pay for it. This is important. And to all of the funders in the room, if you are a funder in this room, if you are in a funding relationship in this room, I have to bow to you. Because when we got land, everybody expected us to go into a commercial production farm and create revenue-generating experiences for our indigenous economics, right? Mm-hmm. Very reasonable model, and one we totally understand. However, last year, we donated 16,000 pounds of food out to the Bay Area indigenous community, all free. That feels really special. And so I am grateful to our funders at the Cultural Conservancy. I'm grateful to my board of directors who hasn't made us kind of explore that deeper. I'm just grateful that there are people who are willing to show up in our food systems and say, we are willing to explore it. And to the funders in particular, thank you. Because when I ask you for money in order to support our food justice program, you understand that I'm asking you for money. That means I don't have to sell it. And we can just give it to our community members who need it. One of our incredible partners is the beautiful Indigenous chef, Crystal Wapapa. Crystal has opened an Indigenous food restaurant in the Oakland Bay Area. We invite you all to come if you ever are there. This is another way that we can help through our systems of sharing and knowledge. We invited the chefs of this restaurant to come out with their seeds of these squash systems so that they can start their earlier relationship in food knowledge and food sharing all the way at planting. So now every spring, the chefs and the cooking team of the kitchen come out, they plant their seeds, they help harvest at the end of the season, and then they go cook them in their systems, and they share that food in their restaurant, and that's how we're bringing these communities together. So deep nod. There's the squash that ends up in the restaurants, there's the Indian lettuce that we're cultivating in the field, and our deep commitment to all of our many generations to come together, to share these systems, and get to know one another. And that's my Bubby in the corner. I miss her. Hi, Bubby. So thank you. Right with you.
Thank you so much, Sara, Christine, Clifford, and Dave. I think we're out of time, but I would welcome everyone to come up and ask more questions about this amazing work that we're doing, and thank you so much for your time and your interest.